Good afternoon, good afternoon. Happy Thursday, happy February, and happy Black History Month. I'm Senegal Alfred Mabry. Welcome to the Hunt Institute's Race and Education webinar on the intersections between racism and gender in education policy. Many thanks to our amazing panelists, Sophia Arredondo, Director of Education and Youth Programs at GLSEN, Shayla Giles, Board Chair at the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, Rodrigo Lettinen, Deputy Executive Director at the National Center for Transgender Equality, and our moderator, Carlos Velasquez, Chief Program Officer of the Boys Club of New York. Thank you immensely to all of our amazing panelists for joining us for today's conversation. Thank you to the team behind the scenes at the Hunt Institute for making sure this conversation happens today. Jen, Abigail, James, who are working behind the scenes. And thank you to all of you, our amazing attendees who are joining in for today's conversation. We want to hear your perspectives, your ideas, your engagement during today's event. So make sure you use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen to post your questions and comments during today's event. Also, feel free to use the hashtag #RaceAndEducation on Twitter, where we can see your perspectives and engage with your ideas there as well. So again, thank you immensely for this amazing conversation on the intersections between racism and gender in education policy, led by Sophia Arredondo, Director of Education and Youth Programs at GLSEN, Shayla Giles, Board Chair of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, Rodrigo Lettinen, Deputy Executive Director at the National Center for Transgender Equality, and Carlos Velasquez, Chief Program Officer at the Boys Club of New York. I'm going to turn it over to our empathetic Director of Equity Initiatives, Ramon de Jesus, to begin the conversation with some welcoming remarks. Ramon.
Thanks, Senegal, and thanks for everyone joining us today. For those of you who may be joining for the first time, the Hunt Institute was created by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt to be an education policy resource for state leaders looking to advance equity in education. This webinar series is a continuation of that hard work, lifting up some of the most relevant conversations that live at the intersection of race and American public education. Today, we are excited to feature a panel of colleagues fighting for equity in the lives of some of our most marginalized community members, and we consider ourselves fortunate and lucky to be able to host this conversation. While in recent years, the education sector has become increasingly aware of the needs of LGBTQ young people, we have a long way to go in affirming the identities of these community members. Moreover, when we add the lens of race to an analysis of the realities faced by LGBTQ students, we can see just how short our lofty aspirations we have fallen. According to a survey conducted by GLSEN, 56% of Native American, 43% of Latinx, and 32% of Black LGBTQ students feel unsafe at school because of their gender identity. During this pandemic, many have focused on the academic disruptions caused by COVID-19. However, long before we worry about the academic outcomes for our students, both before, during, and after this pandemic, the dignity, safety, and well-being of our students has to be centered above all else. With that said, I'd like to thank our panelists today for leading us through a conversation on the intersections between race and gender in education. We invited you all to lead us through today's conversation because of your commitment to safeguarding our children and speaking truth to power. Again, we feel fortunate to be in your presence. With that, I'll turn it over to my longtime dear friend and colleague, Carlos Velasquez, to get the conversation started. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramon, and happy Thursday to all. Really excited to be a part of this. I want to thank the Hunt Institute for putting this together on such an important topic. So as Ramon said, I'm Carlos Velasquez. I'm the Chief Program Officer at the Boys Club of New York. Since 1876, we've been serving young men in underserved communities in New York City by providing social emotional support, an outlet and an opportunity to grow, but an opportunity to find their passion. We focus on what we call the 4 C's, and it's that our boys are competent, confident, connected, and character rich. And we do that in a number of ways, but one of the big ways on being comfortable in their own skin, being comfortable in their identity, being comfortable in the identity of those around them, and figuring out how to build community. So I'm excited about being a part of this webinar today. I'm super excited about the panelists and the work they've done in the field. And I want to jump right into it because I want to make sure that everyone gets their time in to really focus on the work that they're doing. and that we can get to some questions also. So Shira, I'm going to start with you, and I'll ask you to introduce yourself and how you identify, but also how with the needs of children, how are the needs of children of color impacted by how they experience and how society responds to their gender identity?
Hisjay Stongo. My name is Shayla Giles. I'm a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation and of Cherokee descent. I'm a behavioral health specialist for a tribal project, and I serve as chairwoman of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. And I come to you today from Northern Virginia, and my pronouns are she and her. Kind of a big question right off the bat and to get started and trying to make sure we have time for everyone to participate. But we have seen this, and especially from an indigenous perspective, we know this since contact and colonization, that our people haven't been treated fairly from the beginning, and they didn't want us to be identified as Indian, let alone as male or female, or however we wanted to define ourselves. So we go back to that time and that place and carrying that historical trauma with us. And for a lot of our schooling across Indian country, across the United States, whether it's on reservation in a tribally run school or a Bureau of Indian Education run school or just a public school within our community, trying to find that identity has been greatly diminished over time, because a lot of times you don't see people that look like us. I went to a public high school in Oklahoma, and it was a handful of Native Americans in the school, and a lot of them were what we consider identifiable. So just growing up and knowing those challenges our students face, and especially like you said, during this time of COVID and pandemic, and then trying to do school virtually, there are a lot of compounding factors to an already stressed system and to an already stressed society that our young people are growing up very differently than maybe we did during our time as well. So I don't think I have a clear answer, but definitely want to start that conversation, because it is a bigger conversation than just a quick answer. Thank you.
Definitely, and appreciate that. Rodrigo, same question. Please introduce yourself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Rodrigo Hangleytonin with the National Center for Transgender Equality. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a transgender man myself. So I was raised as a girl, but man now, and Cuban American myself. And thank you, everyone, for being here. It's amazing being a panelist and seeing the little count on the bottom of the Zoom screen keep going up. More people are joining us. It's very exciting. So thanks for taking the time out of your certain busy schedules to be here. Yeah, it's a big question to start off with, but I'll just kind of do a little, at least to try to scratch the surface, which is that one of the things we're really seeing at NCTE is that thankfully educational institutions are doing more analysis and reflection on racial justice, and they're doing it on transgender, about the growing transgender student body. But those are two separate conversations that are not coming together, and recognition that there are trans youth of color in schools all over the country. There are students who are dealing with both of these realities, and it comes together in their own unique way. So one concrete example of this we see is dress codes. Dress codes are a fact of life in schools, and they seem like an innocuous detail sometimes, but they are often needlessly gendered. And then, so they put trans youth or youth who are questioning their gender in a box that they can't get out of, or they feel like they can't even comfortably get dressed in the morning coming to class. Then on top of it, we see the enforcement of these dress codes be totally racialized. So students of color are penalized way more often for what are supposedly dress code violations, even when you have the same students, dressed in the same way. The students who are of color are more likely to be penalized and be disciplined for it than the white students. And when you think about that from the experience of a trans student or a student who is figuring out their gender identity and is kind of exploring what's authentic for them, it is something as simple as a dress code becomes a minefield for a young trans person of color in school. So they're already stressed, already uncomfortable at the very least, or maybe even unsafe at the worst, before they even start their first class for the day. And there's also so many more issues when we think about police in schools and these enhanced security measures that are really actually dangerous and put a lot of trans youth of color in unsafe situations. They are backfiring. They are not effective forms of public safety. And then the last thing I'll flag, because I'm probably going over my time, is to really be thinking carefully about the role of parents in this. One of the things that really shows up very often for trans youth of color is that a lot of the infrastructure of schooling kind of makes the assumption that there's two parents in the household and that those two parents can be really involved and are really supportive. But a lot of people don't have that kind of structure in their lives. And especially for trans youth, the parents might not be supportive. It might very well be that the school is where the young person feels most comfortable. And it's actually when they go home and deal with parents that the parents are hostile, are questioning the legitimacy of even being transgender. And especially with youth of color, we see a lot of, we really struggle with that. A lot of families perceive being transgender as quote unquote a white people thing, which is absolutely not. Transgender people and gender variance has existed across time, generations, all around the world, in every culture. But there are all these complicated reasons why in some families it can still be seen as, oh, that no parte de nuestra cultura, like not part of our culture, like that's not us. So trans youth in general, and sometimes trans youth of color in particular, don't necessarily have the support of their families. And that really shows up in school when you think about all the activities where young people might need parental consent or parental approval. So that's a good thing to be mindful of, that not everyone has the same family background and not everyone might be able to get that kind of support at home as they do in the classroom.
Awesome. Thank you, Rodrigo. And definitely want to dive into that a little more in a few, but we're going to turn it over to Sophia, please. Happy to have you here. I'd love to have you introduce yourself.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. And I'm honored to be in the same Zoom room with you all and out there in the interwebs. So I'm Sophia. I use she, her, and aya pronouns. I'm the Director of Education and Youth Programs for GLSEN, as mentioned before. Part of the identities that are most important to me are being a parent, being a queer parent, having navigated the public school system with a queer son. So the work for me is incredibly personal. I feel like it's my purpose. But I would echo a lot of what Rodrigo said, and is it Shira? Shira? That like a fine wine. And I would echo a lot of the things that have already been said. I think where there's a huge lack, and the kind of work that GLSEN is also doing in partnership with some of these same organizations, is looking at policies from an intersectional lens. So addressing racial disparities, as well as the impact of damaging policies around gender identity and sexual orientation are really critical. So thinking about how schools are doing equity work from an intersectional lens, so that they're not compartmentalizing what the needs are for trans students or for students of color or for girls or boys, but that really addressing gender diversity from a multi-layered lens and from a multi-layered approach, so that you don't necessarily get a one size fits all, but you consider all of the identities that are at play, and not just the identities, but the kinds of systemic oppression that impact students' lives. So if it's poverty, if I'm a first generation immigrant, and so for a time undocumented, so thinking about how these other forms of oppression play out in the school system is really critical. So so I would just say addressing these issues from an intersectional lens is really critical. And when we're thinking about practice, when we're thinking about professional development, as schools are moving towards incorporating anti-racist professional development, how to become an anti-racist school, anti-racist classrooms, that you are including LGBTQ equity issues at the center as well. And also students with disabilities and students of color with disabilities. The disproportionate amount of Black students who receive IEPs and then lack of support has to be addressed. And in the same consideration, we have to consider LGBTQ students as well. So there's a lot of work to do. This is like the $1 million question I think you started with. So look forward to being a little more detailed as we move along. Thank
Yeah,
you.
definitely, and I think it's important when we think about, you know, what is a safe space when it comes to schools and when it comes for our young people inside schools. I know we talk a lot about it, and you know, in the nonprofit world, we always talk about buzzword bingo, right? And safe spaces is the buzzword. I have a safe space for our students or for our members, but really thinking about what that means when it comes to, you know, who are the people we're bringing in the building. You know, there's a big focus on safety of young people, and we talk about metal detectors in the building. I was at a workshop and someone I'm less concerned about what kids are bringing in than what are the adults bringing in mentally into the building, and how they're treating our young people, and how are they kind of putting them into boxes instead of really letting them self-express. So, you know, I think that, you know, falls in line with a lot of what we're hearing from you guys, but also I think is a good segue to continue this conversation. Rodrigo, I have a question for you. Is, you know, how would you describe the current state of safety for transgender children across the nation, and really looking at it with the implications for school leaders and education policymakers in relation to these realities? And I know you touched about it in your introduction, but, you know, let's dive a little more into that.
Sure. This is a really complicated moment for education policy when it comes to trans youth of color, especially because we're seeing this dual reality where, on the one hand, some school principals and educational institutions and all these stakeholders are becoming more interested and curious about how to support their young people, which is fantastic. And on the other hand, we also have explicitly anti-transgender groups weaponizing transgender young people as a way to peel away support for transgender rights writ large. So we have this push and pull of both progress and backlash happening simultaneously. That results in a very uneven experience for individual young people. So if you are a young trans youth of color in one school versus another school a few districts away, you might end up having a totally different experience, depending on who the adults with more access to power, what their beliefs happen to be. And we really need to ensure that this becomes an even experience, that all young people actually have a positive interaction in the classroom and in the school system. One thing to really be aware of, especially in the education space, is that some states are now actively pursuing bans on transgender student athletes. That we started seeing this in a few state legislatures a couple of years ago, but momentum has really increased. This is now snowballing, where now, as it stands at this point, I think we have something like a dozen states, maybe up to 18, that either right now as we speak have introduced a trans student athlete ban, or we're getting intel that they are going to introduce it, that there is a reasonable threat of this happening. And these bills really are, they're as extreme as they sound. They are attempts to actually ban transgender young people from playing school sports. These are directly targeting K through 12 students, especially in public schools. It's really heartbreaking to think that adults in elected office would single any kind of young person out for harm. I mean, this is state legislators picking on transgender youth in schools and putting a target on their back. That is just, I think, unethical. No matter what you think about other kinds of debates about policy, the idea that adults would just target trans young people like that is unacceptable. So I would really urge everyone to look up, if you hear anything about your state entertaining a bill like this, speak to your legislators. They really need to hear from educators and really hear that educators and leaders in the education space don't stand for this, that educators actually support their transgender youth. So that's really huge. You know, on the other hand, again, we have some states making a lot of progress, but it's a very uneven landscape. So the other thing I would say really quickly is I'd urge anyone in a school district, whether you're in a school district or work at an individual school, to develop an affirmative policy. Don't just think that, oh, we don't have anything written down that's anti-trans, therefore that's enough. Instead, you need to develop policies that actually are affirmative, that are proactive, that are really saying loudly, we support transgender youth. That's what's going to set the tone for a better environment for everyone.
Awesome. Thank you, Rodrigo. Sophia, so how do your colleagues at GLSEN define a positive school climate? You know, what can educational leaders do to foster a positive school climate for students who are being marginalized around their intersectional identities?
Yeah, again, I really want to echo and appreciate what you shared, Rodrigo, because it really feels like there is just such a hostile climate that's being built, and folks are being invited to really target our trans youth. And definitely want to encourage folks who are educators, who are educational leaders, to get policies passed. To also encourage your state level legislators to pass policies that have both anti-discrimination policies that are enumerated, that call out gender identity and expression as protections, and then to have those implemented at the school district level. And even if you don't have a state policy, to implement some guidance around how to best support transgender students. So that's one of our, GLSEN has done research for 2 decades now. Our National School Climate Survey gives a reflection of kind of the 4 supports that really help build out a positive school climate. And one of those is enumerated policies. So whether that's at the state level, at the school district level, local level, those policies are critical. Again, anti-discrimination policies, policies that help support and guide supports for transgender and non-binary students, inclusive sexual health that is reflective of LGBTQ students' experiences and identities is also important. And anti-bullying policies as well. And enumerated policies are so important because there's too much room for interpretation when it's not specific. And we know that students experience less harassment when their school policies are enumerated. But what's equally important is that educators know that these policies exist. So a supportive educator is also one of the 4 pillars for creating a safe and inclusive school community. But they've got to be educated. They have to be educated on how to intervene anti-LGBTQ harassment, particularly for transgender students. They need to know that transgender students in particular, and students of color, have rights. So we have our pronouns here next to our name. That is just as critical to transgender students who are in your Zoom classrooms right now, if they feel safe to do so. A pronoun affirmation is like one way to show allyship with the LGBTQ community, with transgender folks in particular. It's one thing you can do. It starts a conversation about the importance of pronouns. The other 2 pillars are inclusive curriculum. So it's really critical particularly for students of color, for LGBTQ students of color, to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. They need to know what the possibilities are, what their past history has shown them. We have Transcestors, Marsha P. Johnson, and many others, Silvio Rivera. I think these are the two that get highlighted the most, but there are so many others. Polly Murray is also a really great example. As you teach Black History Month, make sure that you're including LGBTQ Black icons, heroes, contributors, scientists to your curriculum. Don't have students wait until they possibly go to college to be able to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. And then the last one is gender and sexuality alliances. We know that when there is an LGBTQ identity-based club on school campuses, that it reduces the rate of harassment, both physical and verbal harassment for students. Students are more likely to feel like they belong. I will say too that research is so critical, and something that GLSEN has done for the last 20 years is accumulated research through our National School Climate Survey, but also recently, and I'm gonna, if it's okay, drop some links as folks are sharing and talking, so that our audience folks have information and resources. But most recently, our research institute issued the Erasure and Resilience the Experiences of LGBTQ plus Students of Color, with special reports on Asian Pacific Islander, Black, Latinx, and Native and Indigenous LGBTQ youth. It's critical, if you don't have data on LGBTQ youth of color in your school systems, in your school districts, that you find it, that you create it. Because how are we informing policy? How are we informing practice without data? And so because there is such little data, we really encourage folks to look at GLSEN's data in order to help inform some of the things that might be happening at your schools. So it's supportive educators, identity-based clubs, policies, and inclusive curriculum that are really critical to positive school climates. And again, when we're talking about youth of color, we need to also address policies around discipline. We need to get police out of schools. That includes SROs. We need to reinvest, particularly now as students have experienced the racial justice movement, that we have to have these conversations in our classrooms, and we have to have practices and policies that reflect that we are committed to racial justice across all of our educational institutions.
Thank you so much, Sophia, for that. And I think it's very important highlighting the impact of giving the information to our young people and having them being a part of the process. I think that they're stimulated all the time by what they see on the web, what they see on social media, what they hear in the news. And, for a very long time, we've kind of glossed over it, right? It's just, we'll deal with it when it's the right time, but it's the right time now. They're dealing with it every single day. So I think it's crucial that we're having these conversations with our young people. Shira, how has the public visibility of increasing violence towards women and young women of color shaped the mission and work of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center?
It seems like we're in a time now with social media that we're actually getting attention as Indigenous people of this land. Historically, when you talk about data sets, we all know too well, it's rare you ever see American Indian as an opportunity to respond and check that box. And so to even identify as American Indian and have our stories told. And when it comes to Indigenous populations of the United States, with 574 federally recognized tribes, we have to remember they're all unique and individual. We're not all the same. We're different languages and cultures and traditions, and our communities are vastly different throughout all the United States and Alaska and Hawaii. So the work we're doing in domestic violence and sexual assault is specific to each community, because as federally recognized tribes, as my tribe, the Muskogee Creek, we have 90,000 citizens that we are, that those are our citizenship, and they vote in our elections, and we're responsible for protecting them when they're on our reservation. Now, I live off my reservation, so trying to have that connectivity back to my tribe, and yet my tribe being responsive to me. And then the sovereignty issues where we have our own court systems, we have our own police forces. So it's a constant battle, and it's a constant conversation, because elected leaders don't always understand that American Indian tribes and tribal nations are pre-constitutional. So when we look at trying to protect Native women and children on tribal lands, we have a different court system, and our cultural values are going to be different. And so the work we do through the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center is very much grassroots. We have to work within those tribal communities, with the people in tribal coalitions and tribes that are doing the work in that area, and just advocates and good human beings that are and allies that are in those areas, because it's not cookie cutter. It doesn't look the same for all of us. As I had mentioned, for my tribe and back home, I went to a public school. We do have a tribal school. We have a Bureau Indian Rand school within Oklahoma. There's different avenues in which you're taking, education is expressed. And so, I like what Sophia's mentioned is that, and Rodrigo is it has to be equitable across the board. It's not just, because you're in a public school system that receives more funding, has more resources, versus a rural community that doesn't have access to a lot of additional resources, that message is being carried forth. And how do we get the information to those school systems? We're finding now, with virtual school, a lot of our kids don't have access to the internet. So going to school virtually is non-existent, or you have poor connectivity. They don't have laptops. So it's been a real hustle trying to get all that up to date, and that we can educate our students still while they're at home and in quarantining as they should. And at the same time, how do we open that back up when it is safe to return into buildings? And how do we have that conversation of what information do we have available when we're still just trying to get the basics of pencil and paper and desk, and meeting the students' needs at home as well, but then to come into an environment that may or may not be friendly, and in a group of people that may or may not look like you or have that you identify with. So these national platforms, these national organizations, even the grassroots organization, how do we keep connecting? And at least if you can't, if that's not a possibility within the public or in the school system, then how can we as community leaders and relatives in the community make sure this information is getting out to our young people? And the most critical thing is that we're letting the young people lead that conversation. I'm 43 years old with 4 children. I want to think I'm young. I want to be young, but I don't, again, they grow up in such a different time with technology and language and barriers and the way that they're facing society. It's it's very important that these young people are having that conversation and that voice, and that they're helping lead that policy discussion and interaction, and that we're not just sitting back as adults and saying, oh, we know what's best for all the young people. We don't always know what's best. So help leading and guiding and reaching out to our young people is vitally important as well. Through the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, we do have a Young Ambassadors program. They kicked off our Native Love campaign. In February is Teen Dating Violence Prevention Month. So right now we're really highlighting what that looks like. What do healthy relationships look like? And again, that it's not the traditional male-female role that we've all been taught to look at, but all those different aspects and those conversations we need to be having around that. So we're proud of that work, and that our young ambassadors are carrying that message forward throughout Indian country as well.
Yeah. And I think you make a great point about the visibility and also being aligned with the data that's out there right now. I think that, at the Boys Club of New York, we're really committed into connecting with our young men and connecting with our families, but also understanding during this COVID time, we have a lot of young men who, like you said, Rodrigo, school was the safe space, right? They left home sometimes because the schools that they were set up in a way where they felt valued. They felt that they were being respected, and now that was taken away from them. And now there might be in a home environment where the implications are really serious. There's a study by Michael Lindsay, who's the executive director at the McSilver Institute of Poverty and Policy and Research at NYU, and it was called Ring the and it's the crisis of Black youth suicide in America. Between 1991 and 2017, the suicide rate for African-American young men increased by 73%. But then if you look at their transgender numbers, it's 65% more likely, or 82% more likely to have suicidal ideations, or 65% more likely to actually attempt suicide. And we know the issues on why LGBTQ youth are dealing with certain levels of depression or not feeling a part of a society. So now that we've taken away school and it's a virtual world, it's even more important for us to be reaching out to our young people and for the organizations that we all work in to make sure we're connected and they're connected. You know, I'm very proud that at the Boys Club in New York, we've made sure every single one of our members has a laptop and we're working on connectivity issues. But it's a reality that we have to keep these connections with our young people. So, you know, as we talk about safe space, as we talk about, you know, involving our young people, we can't forget the fact that, you know, we have to get out there and we have to kind of make sure that we're staying in touch with them and they have the tools to stay in touch with us. So I want to jump into some Q&A, and we have some time now, so I'm excited to get to some questions. So I'm actually going to open up the chat to see some of the great questions that have been put out. And there's a couple of questions around policy and around how to support instituting new policy within schools and within different environments, and giving some advice on, you know, how to approach that, where, you know, some people are maybe wary to bring up concerns around certain issues. So I'll throw this out to the panel and anyone can jump in. You know, what are some ways to approach this? What are some ways to create supportive policies in school culture within schools?
Well, I could start with something, and then I'm sure my co-panelists can chime in with more. One thing that we would recommend is to look through all of your current policies and spot where gender is referenced. We find that a lot of times gender is referenced in places where it's not really necessary after all. For example, dress code, which I talked about earlier. You don't really need a completely separate dress code for boys and girls, so much as you can say, you know, if you're wearing a skirt, it shouldn't be any shorter than X length. That can be universal. That doesn't have to be only for girls or only for one particular gender. And, you know, to be clear, it doesn't mean I'm telling you abandon a dress code. I get it. You can keep a dress code, but the idea is that it just be a uniform one so that a student can, you know, wear pants or skirt or whatever it is, regardless of what gender they identify with. And this is especially important for younger, the younger you go, because that's the younger someone is, the more likely they are to still be questioning, still be exploring. It's really critical for a student's sense of comfort in the classroom that they be able to kind of have that fluidity while they can still figure things out. So I'd really recommend looking at your current policies, seeing where gender is listed, and look, hey, is this for a really positive reason because we're trying to ensure equity? Or is this just something we got used to? Is this just something we have as a holdover from before, and maybe we strike that one?
And go ahead, Sophie.
I would add too, you know, dress code, I think clothes in general as a form of expression are really important to students. It expresses their individuality, and I think some of the things we're hearing from our students in our network that is equally important. And when I was working at San Diego Unified School District, we were trying to move schools to different, like no graduation gowns that were gendered, right? You don't have to have gendered, you know, boys don't have to wear a particular color and girls another color. It can be, I know of so many trans students that never participated in their graduation ceremonies because they were forced to choose a color. particularly for non-binary students. They were like, nope, just not going to do it. And so that's a pivotal moment in a student's life, is to be able to attend their graduation ceremony, as we have learned through COVID with, you know, the heartbreak of seniors who don't get to have a ceremony in the traditional sense. So we know that's important to them. That's something that can be changed. And it can push against this notion of tradition. You know, I heard a lot of principals tell me, well, it's our tradition. And I was like, and traditions can change. And traditions can lean into new values, expanded, more inclusive values that make everybody feel like they belong. Then the other one is, you know, proms, dances, making sure that you can bring anyone. It doesn't have to be the opposite gender. All these moments of joy and celebration for students is so critical. And so those are like really like very local policies or guidance procedures that can change immediately. Ensuring that overnights, that students get to decide who they want to buddy up with, so that they're in a safe environment, so that you know, principals and school leaders are not getting overly worked up around, you know, who's going to be sleeping in which room with whom. We have solutions to that, and on our GLSEN website you can find, we have recommendations for different practices. Another simple practice is language, referring to students as students, scholars, maybe it's your school mascot, whatever it is, brilliant thinkers versus boys and girls, and then not separating boys and girls into different lines, right? If you are a gender specific school, that when you say boys, you mean all boys. So that means trans boys too. It's an all girls school, you mean all girls. That means trans girls too. Trans girls are girls, trans boys are boys. So that's just kind of some easy practices at the beginning there. And then I think approach wise too is inviting families into the conversation, particularly families of color who may have a historically traumatized experience, particularly with the public school system, is that we have to invest in the communities in which we teach. And so we have to invite families to be part of this conversation and not be afraid to invite them in, and to hear what their concerns might be, to demystify what we mean around LGBTQ, and it doesn't mean sex, it's about identities, right? And then we've always existed. So I think the approach is about relationship building, repair, transparency, and then input from families, and always having the student at the center, because students will tell us what they need if we listen. And then at the legislative level, if we could get if we could get policies like anti-discrimination and anti-bullying policies to be inclusive of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, that would be a really great start. And at the federal level, if we could get the students, what is it? Oh, gosh, I'm forgetting what it's called. Hold on really quickly. I just want to make sure that the Student Success Act, the Safe Schools Improvement Act, excuse me. There's so many that sound the same. If we could get that passed at the federal level, so that across the board, states have the same standards, so that, as what Rodrigo mentioned in the beginning around, a student shouldn't have to have a different experience in one school that is 5 miles away from the one that student is currently at, that there is alignment in student experience when it comes to protections.
You know, that's great. And sticking with, excuse me, policy and administration, I have a question for you, Shira. So how will you characterize the significance of the increased representation of indigenous leaders in elective office? You know, what do you believe this will mean for indigenous students and families moving forward?
Absolutely. I mean, it was groundbreaking to have someone that, again, looked like us, that came from our community, that understands the difference of Indian country and tribal sovereignty. So with the election and placement of new Congresswomen, Deb Haaland and Sharice Davids, it was huge. And it was, you know, especially for me as an indigenous woman, to say, yeah, we've made it. We've always been here. Now there's someone here that looks like us and can carry, again, that conversation forward. We've had other indigenous males in leadership as well. And again, not identified, but they're not actively brown or, you know, and didn't, the names weren't distinct. So it was hard to tell and unfortunately that we still have that we have leaders, elected leaders that are citizens of their tribes, but yet aren't culturally connected to their tribes. And that's a huge distinction. And people sometimes are taking that as word value. Oh, I speak for all Indian people. You know, a mascot was mentioned a few times as because schools have mascots. Well, we know the Washington team name, you know, we finally seen some change there as well. So for us, it does feel like in Indian country, we're finally getting some recognition. The world's starting to see and hear a little bit more. And when I say Indian country, you know, that's a specific legal term recognized through the federal government, but it is unique to us. It is unique. So when we say, you know, we're different in the sense of as people of color that we have these sovereign nations. So we have rules and we have constitutions and elections that are different than the rest of the population, because we have to have that treaty and trust to trust relationship with the United States. So to have people that, and again, are all representative, this new federal administration, they're putting people in offices, again, that are representative of the United States. That's huge for all, you know, all of us and for our students and our young people to say, wow, yeah, they're doing it. And now we're seeing that opportunity. And unfortunately, that's what it's been. It's been an opportunity to step into that limelight or step into that role and get that recognition that, again, we're in this equally and that we're participating. So having those elected leaders are huge, and that they've been carrying our message. Now they don't speak for all tribes and all specifically, but as good elected leaders are, they're here listening to their communities back home and trying to share those messages forward. So, and I think we've seen that across all of our elected positions. You know, we're seeing that diversity. And so I think that's the exciting time. And that's if COVID's brought us anything else, that you know, we're having to pay attention to social media. We're meeting more virtually. So it is an opportunity for us to connect a little bit closer in a different way, if not in person, but at least through the virtual means, and having that access to elected officials in that way, because they're having to do different town hall meetings and such in a different way as well. So I think that's important, you know, that we are seeing identifiable people that look like us throughout all systems and throughout all of our communities. And that's what's important. You mentioned disabilities. You know, my daughter has Down syndrome, so it's important for me to help carry her message when, you know, she's out in the community, what her needs are. You know, and we don't see enough of, you know, those conversations going forward. And I see that was one of the questions when you're a person of color, in a minority, transgender, and with a disability, how do we, you know, where's the safe places to go? Who are the educated? Who are your advocates and your fighters that are fighting for the same rights that should be given to all students? So that's where all the work, that's where we're all still working towards. And we do that collectively, that we're not doing that in silos, that we are trying to work together across all organizations and across all peoples and all schools and communities.
Definitely appreciate that. Rodrigo, I have a question for you, and I'm gonna start closing out. But you know, one of the areas where you and your team have been very active is advocating for the passage of the Equality Act. Can you speak to what this legislation would entail and what is on the line for the people you fight for?
Definitely. This is one of our top priorities for this year. For anyone who's not already familiar, the Equality Act is a bill that would update everyone's non-discrimination protections to protect a lot more of us in a lot more places. It's usually thought of as an LGBTQ non-discrimination bill, which is true. But what's less known is that it also expands protections on the basis of race and ethnicity too. A lot of people are surprised to learn that there's actually no federal law saying that you can't discriminate against someone on the basis of their sexual orientation, nor on the basis of their gender identity. So the Equality Act would fix that. The Equality Act would add sexual orientation and gender identity so that it really would be obvious. It would really be clear and black and white that you can't kick someone out of a store just because they happen to be a same-sex couple, or you can't hurt a student because they come out as trans, things like that. Now, there's other policy, there's other legislation that addresses some of this stuff in schools, but the Equality Act would make it uniform, it would make it obvious, it just clarifies it for everybody. It also, like I was mentioning on the basis of race, it expands the places where it is illegal to discriminate on the basis of race. It's technically not illegal to do that in stores, for example, because our non-discrimination protections on race are from the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and that was a different time, and they weren't able to make it as comprehensive as I think we would all agree it should be. So the Equality Act would also fill all those gaps so that everyone's protected in public spaces and schools and housing and employment, all of that. We're really heartened that it's going to get passed in the House this year, but it's going to be a bigger fight in the Senate. So if you support the Equality Act, which I hope you do, then I'd really urge you to call your senators. But this is really something that would help our schools as well, because again, it would just make a lot of this policy so clear, and also more subtly, it would just set the tone. It would just send a message that LGBTQ young people are worthy of respect, worthy of protection, that adults are supposed to help LGBTQ young people, not harm them. So really urge support for the Equality Act.
Thank you. So we're coming to the end now, and this has been amazing. I'm sure we could stay here for hours talking about this, and the ways that we can support our young people and way we can support positive change. But in closing, if we can go around and we'll start with you, Shira. And what is one change you hope to see, or you'll be advocating for in the next 4 years to remove barriers for our young people currently marginalized?
Yeah, absolutely. Just as Rodrigo had mentioned, having those relationships with the elected officials and making those phone calls and taking that information back to our communities. How do we make it easy for people to participate? And giving them talking points so that anybody can call a legislator and say, hey, we need this. And again, just sharing that information, and then coming from an indigenous perspective, keep elevating our voices and keep advocating for those things, and reaching out to partners like you, and reaching out and saying, hey, this is where we need help. The Violence Against Women Act is still up for reauthorization. We have to make sure everybody's inclusive of that, including transgender and LGBTQ, because we've seen that a few years back when it was last reauthorized, that they wanted to cut out immigrants, they wanted to cut out LGBTQ, they wanted to cut provisions back for American Indians. So it was important that all of us have on that same conversation, and ultimately it came down to that. It's either for all of us or against all of us. So having that collective voice, and that we're sharing in that partnership to say, yes, we want to make sure we're all protected under that Violence Against Women Act. So for the next 4 years, we're hoping to continue to push that and continue to see increased provisions across the board, and increased funding for communities that are in the most need. And we know that historically have been communities of color and minority communities. So just keep doing what we do best, and that's reaching out and being good advocates and good neighbors. And I think we're in a good time to continue to see that, and we appreciate all of you for being a part of that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Shira. So Sophia, what's your 4-year plan? What are we fighting for here? What are we gonna make happen?
Well, what I would really like to see more of are conversations like this one, and I would love to see more coalition building across organizations, so that the intersections of race, of gender identity, of disability, of all the aspects that really impact our students are being addressed all at the same time. We are moving towards a larger and deeper understanding of gender, racial, and disability justice and educational outcomes, and in our resources, in our professional development that we're pushing out through our chapter network for educators. So I also just hope that the momentum that has grown over the summer and into the fall and now into the spring around racial justice continues, that it's elevated and embraced, as uncomfortable as it may be, into our public school systems, our charter and our private schools. That educational equity is a priority for this administration, and we will continue, I know from our public policy office in Washington, D.C., to push for that. And I look forward to relationship building with folks that are out there in the audience. I saw lots of questions. I tried to address some of them privately, and just encourage you to email me if you like, or educators@glisten.org. To keep the conversation going.
No, definitely, and we're looking forward to the Twitter town hall where we'll be able to get to some more of these questions. And Rodrigo, we talked about the Equality Act, but what's going on in the next 4 years that you're really going to be championing and advocating for?
Well, I would echo a lot of what Shira and Sophia already said. One thing I would add as another detail is that we're really looking to work with the Department of Education federally to issue updated guidance. We've kind of referenced guidance in some other times in this panel. We really need the Biden administration to clarify a lot of these things for schools. There's a lot of young people coming out as trans and more schools and at younger and younger ages, which is great. And the adults around them are kind of like, wait, what do we do? So it's really, really useful for these education stakeholders to have guidance from the federal government for at least the minimum legal obligations, if nothing else. So we're really looking for the Department of Education to at least reissue guidance that had been issued before and then revoked by the previous administration, and then actually update the guidance. The guidance from, I believe it was 2015, maybe 2016. Well, the world's changed a lot in those 5-6 years. What was considered really groundbreaking then is still good now, but we can go even further. And we've also known that there a lot more detail is needed. More issues are emerging with locker rooms and confidentiality for when a young person discloses a new name or pronoun to a teacher, and the teacher is wondering, do I need to report that or not? There's a lot of intricacies where education stakeholders would benefit from clarity from the federal government, and it would really help everyone involved and reduce confusion. So we're really looking to work with the Department of Education on that to kind of make everyone's lives easier, answer some questions, and just set a standard.
Thank you. I just want to end by first just thanking you all. This has been amazing. The wealth of knowledge and the passion that you all have for this work is something that is commendable, and something that hopefully infuses some passion in others to continuing making change. I appreciate the Hunt Institute for putting this together and giving us a platform to have these conversations. The one thing that I would like to leave everyone with is that, make sure that we keep our young people's voice at the center of everything that we do. I think sometimes we can get lost in the work that we do and the passion that we have, but things change. But sometimes just listening to the young people that are impacted day to day around this work and around these policies and around these issues is the most important. At the Boys Club in New York, we start a lot of our events and with half of the group saying, I respect you, and the other half saying, I respect you also. And that level of respect is something that we have to continue giving them so they can give others, and hopefully they grow into the leaders, giving respect to those that they encounter in their world. So again, thank you to all of you. And I want to send it over now to Senegal to close us out.
Thank you, Carlos, for just an amazing moderation of a phenomenal conversation on the intersections between racism and gender and education policy. Thank you to our amazing panelists, Sophia, Rodrigo, Shara, for bringing your energy, bringing your enthusiasm and bring your expertise to this conversation. To all of you in the audience, thank you also for joining us. We hope that you join us for our next webinar happening here at the Hunt Institute with our Homeroom with Education Leaders series and our following Race and Education webinar on culturally responsive pedagogy and the arts. We will be hosting a follow-up Twitter town hall for this event on February 11th at 12 p.m. So keep an eye out for an email announcing the details for that. But thank you immensely to all of you for joining us for our first webinar in our Black History Month for 2021, and looking forward to continuing these conversations.
Thank you.